This is a podcast from the South China Morning Post.
It can't be controlled for security reasons by China. Too big, too invasive, and it can't be.
Our TikTok community is in crisis.
TikTok, with its viral dance routines and political activism videos, is a favourite among teenagers worldwide.
I set a date of around September 15th, at which point it's going to be out of business in the United States.
We want to see untrusted Chinese apps removed from U.S. app stores.
A new strategy called Clean Store, Clean Cloud, Clean Network, where essentially the U.S. wants Chinese apps that it sees as untrusted scrubbed from American app stores and vice versa.
Great asset, but it's not a great asset in the United States unless they have the approval of the United States. So it'll close down on September 15th unless Microsoft or somebody else is able to buy it.
U.S. politicians keep using the excuse of protecting national security and abusing the country's power to curb Chinese high-tech companies.
With parent companies based in China, apps like TikTok, WeChat, and others are significant threats to personal data of American citizens, not to mention tools for CCP content censorship.
Hello and welcome to the US-China trade war update with me, Finbar Birmingham, on the political economy desk here at the South China Morning Post. TikTok, the clock is ticking. It is Friday in Hong Kong, and Washington has just taken forceful steps to crack down on the use of Chinese internet apps in the United States. WeChat and TikTok look to be the first against the wall, with a 45-day deadline set for American firms and people to stop transacting with these platforms. This goes beyond the trade war, beyond the tech war, and most people who have spent any time in China will tell you that this is borderline culture war. As luck would have it, we were just off the line with our US Bureau Chief Robert Delaney this morning when the news dropped about these executive orders. But nonetheless, we had a great chat about the souring mood and swirling storm clouds in Washington towards Chinese technology. You will hear that in part 2 of this week's show. But first up, I'm joined as ever by our political economy editors John Carter and Joe Shin, who've spent the day parsing this latest news, but who have spent the last week immersed in another rollercoaster 7 days for US-China tensions. Let's get straight on with the show. It's Friday afternoon and I am delighted to be joined on the line from their homes, dotted around Hong Kong, by our political economy editors Joe Shin and John Carter on what has been another seismic day, another momentous week in the US-China rivalry. Just this morning, we had 2 executive orders coming out of the White House where US President Donald Trump banned US individuals or businesses from transacting with TikTok or WeChat, 2 absolutely huge Chinese apps and internet companies. Tencent, also obviously as the owner of WeChat, very involved in this. Guys, just to start this off, how much of an escalation do you view this as? I mean, we've been talking about how the trade war and tech war are interlinked. What we've seen today, how much of an escalation is this?
Well, it's a huge escalation. The hits just keep coming from President Trump, and it's only a matter of time before there's nothing left to sanction on either side. That's a joke. There's so much. The relationship is so deep and so complex that there will always be something going on between China and the U.S., but the depth of the conflict keeps increasing. And a month ago, even a couple of weeks ago, we were vaguely talking about a Cold War. I think we can say pretty definitively we have arrived at what looks to be a Cold War. We started with the trade war, and then the beginnings of a tech war, and this is the latest chapter in the tech war. And also reminded that there's the financial war is heating up. The U.S. Senate has passed legislation that will require Chinese companies listed in America to comply with U.S. accounting standards by 2022, and if they don't, they must delist and leave America. That's the beginning of what is potentially the next chapter in this emerging Cold War, which is a financial war.
It makes me feel nostalgic for the days when I sat up all night waiting for a 5% tariff increase.
Small potatoes now.
Yeah, exactly. Joshin, I wanted to ask you about these executive orders, but more in a holistic way. Everybody's been talking about TikTok over the last few months, really. TikTok is obviously the zeitgeist, but WeChat is far more intrinsic to everyday life in China. Tell us, Joshin, about how important WeChat is in China and how much of a blow and a disruption to daily life this could be for Americans and Chinese people, like if they do sort of create this ban.
Oh yes, thank you, Finbar. As John just said, when 1 year ago we talk about decoupling, we talk about new Cold War, it's basically abstract concept, something in the newspaper, something in the air. But now it's going to be around us. It's about your mobile phone. It's about everybody's life, daily life, and that's really having a huge psychological shock on Chinese audience when the news comes that Trump is going to ban WeChat possibly in 45 days. And because the WeChat is becoming, I think it's downloaded on every Chinese mobile phone now, basically every. And also it is like, for me, I spend 4 or 5 hours maybe on the WeChat every day. Because it's everything, you keep contact with the friends, you get news from that, you pay things from WeChat Pay. And also, this is because this time is particularly interesting for these 5 or 6 million Chinese people in the Chinese-speaking community in the United States, because they are the most likely affected community, because they could be very easily cut from rest of the WeChat users, from their family members, from friends back in China. So, in this morning, it's very interesting. I was in one of the chat groups, and the people in the United States who are using WeChat these days are basically sharing new contacts with all the other members in the chat group. Say, this is my line, this is my WhatsApp. Please record down, because we don't know what will happen tomorrow. Because it's very possible that I wake up tomorrow morning and I find that your WeChat is no longer working, or the WeChat is taken off from the App Store in the United States. So it's really very, very worrying, and this has been a huge psychological impact on the Chinese public.
Yeah, I think one thing that's maybe not being discussed is that this is also going to have a big pushback from American businesses, I reckon. Somebody was saying this morning that if you're a Chinese person and you're forced to choose between iPhone and WeChat, you're going to choose WeChat. So if we take this to the nth degree, and US businesses such as Apple aren't able to host WeChat or other Chinese apps on their app stores, you're not able to have them on your phones. We are really, before we came on air, we were joking about a bamboo iron curtain, or a bamboo tech curtain, or a silicon curtain. But by making consumers make these choices, it's not going to really help American businesses as well. Would you agree with that, folks?
Well, I think it's a new reality now. So, the days are gone when you have one single phone and you can access every app, and, you download one VPN and you can easily access to other US apps in China or in the United States. Don't need anything, just to download Chinese apps as many as you wish. I think if you really want access to the two sides, which is we are now seeing there are two different digital worlds now. You needed basically 2 mobile phones. May I suggest you buy one iPhone and one Huawei, so that makes it safe.
If I could just add, one thing to keep in mind is that China has banned a lot of US apps for years. Facebook, Twitter, Google are not available in mainland China. And China has been a big proponent of digital sovereignty, that every country should be able to set their own rules for the use of the internet. And so you could argue, and I don't necessarily agree with what doing, but you could argue that what Trump is doing is in line with what China has promoted for some time. Now, the practical consequences of what Trump is doing can be potentially devastating and to the world economy, because again, we're talking about relations between the two largest economies in the world. And if you make it harder to do business, it's going to have an impact on the overall global economy, and it's going to hurt. It's going to depress growth, depress incomes, depress jobs. It's not going to be good for anybody.
Yeah, I agree with John. I think so. There's one voice in China, like maybe it's now the United States is doing such bad things of blocking apps. Maybe China should have started doing some good things about lifting these blocks so that Twitter, the Facebook, and Google can be usable by Chinese public. So this is very interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean that, but the counterpoint there, John, is that China doesn't necessarily hold itself up as a beacon of free speech and freedom of expression, whereas the United States does. So I mean, to play the devil's advocate on that point, does the United States, in that regard, want to sink to the levels where it is banning competitor apps and banning, foreign technology and so on? And I suppose that's the debate that we're going to hear a lot more of as we go through this.
Oh, yes, definitely. The whole issue of digital free speech and privacy. I mean, that the Europeans have gone all in on digital privacy. And this is an issue that will play out over years, if not decades. We will have to see.
Absolutely. We have had this morning July trade data from the Chinese Customs Administration. It was interesting. Exports jumped by 7.2% last month, which is much, much higher than analysts had forecast. They thought that they would contract by 0.9%, and that is from a year earlier. The interesting thing that stands out here to me is that in February, March time, we were all writing stories and analysts were telling us that China's in for a huge demand crunch, that the second wave of economic hit was going to hit Chinese exports because of all the shutdowns elsewhere in the world. But what we're seeing in the numbers here is huge sales of things that are actually because of the coronavirus. People are in lockdown and they're buying home entertainment, they're buying electronics, they're buying, of course, masks and PPE and ventilators. But John, it's not really panned out as we expected a few months ago.
No, not even close. I mean, as you pointed out earlier, a few months ago, some analysts were forecasting a 40% decline in exports. We've gone the other way. It means two things. One, it underscores the dependence of the world economy on China being the factory of the world. I mean, even in these very difficult times, China can sell abroad because it makes everything. The other thing is that it reinforces the notion that the Chinese economies are recovering a lot faster than the rest of the world. This is the July data. This is the first month of the third quarter, which suggests that growth is accelerating from the 3.2% that we saw in the second quarter. Some analysts had suggested that, in particular, given what they expected to happen to exports, that is a flattening out of exports, that growth in the third quarter would flatten out. What these figures today suggest is that growth may be more robust than initially expected, and people will be revising up forecasts if this trend continues.
Speak to Joe Sin here. The imports actually were worse than expected, and you on the podcast last week were talking about this sort of dual circulation and how China needs to tell us about how the demand picture in China fits in with the economic plan that you discussed on the podcast last week.
Okay, yes. As John said, China's exports were surprisingly strong. And this also reflects that how China is still relying on external demands to keep its domestic factories, manufacturing operating. And that's one challenge that Chinese leadership has to face when they implement this dual circulation strategy, which means China has to rely on more domestic market. But actually, if you look at the domestic consumption, it's contracting by double digits in the first half, and imports in July still contracted. So which means domestic demand is particularly weak. And if you look at the Chinese imports, yes, iron ore is growing rapidly, but not lots of consumer products. So we can see that this is there's a mismatch, clearly mismatch, at least for now, between Beijing's new economic strategy with reality.
If I could just add, and what Joe Shin says is absolutely right, is there's this two-stage recovery in China. On the one hand, you've got a lot of investment spurred on by the government, but the consumer spending is lagging badly because people are worried about their jobs, they're worried about their incomes. And this, the consumer spending is what has to improve in order for China to be able to rely more on its own domestic economy.
Absolutely. And gents, just before we finish up for today, tell us what's on the agenda for the coming 7 days.
Well, on the 15th or thereabouts, the U.S. and Chinese officials, this is the top level. So this is Liu He, who is the chief trade negotiator and one of President Xi's top economic aides, and Robert Lighthizer, who's the U.S. trade representative and the lead U.S. trade person for Trump, will meet and review the progress or lack thereof in the Phase 1 trade deal. Now, what we've written, what you, Finbar, have written this week is that China has purchased less than half of what it should have purchased to comply with the requirements of that deal. Now, a couple of months ago, Lighthizer was speaking favorably about the deal because of the opening up of the domestic economy. China had opened up to U.S. financial firms, had opened up to automobile companies. There has been more a loosening of the ability of foreign firms to invest in China and operate in China. The question is that going to be enough given how far behind China is on these purchasing targets? We will see. Again, this will happen the 15th, so it's a week from Saturday if it happens on that day. It's going to be a video conference call, and we'll see what they say afterwards.
Absolutely. Jushin, last week on the podcast, you talked about the potential descent upon Beidaihe by China's top brass. Has that happened, or are we still waiting to find out?
We're still waiting to find out. It's very interesting because it's always secretive, but this is particularly important because as we discussed in the last podcast, China had this Politburo meeting and talking about the next 5-year plan and also China's long-term plan up all the way to 2035, which also found a speculation that's a year Chinese President Xi Jinping is having in his vision of having his influence to that date. So, but for now, we haven't seen anything released from the state media or from reliable sources about the whether this Beidaihe meeting is happening or not, and how Mr. Xi or his comrades are kind of building up a consensus around this new strategy, especially before this key meeting in October, the 5th plenum session of the Communist Party Central Committee. So it's all very interesting. We will wait and see.
Absolutely. And we look forward to getting another update on that front. But for today, John Carter, Jushin, thanks a million for joining us. Before we move on to part 2 of this week's episode, when you hear from our US Bureau Chief, Robert Delaney, I just wanted to give you a quick update on some changes coming to the SCMP website. You'll all know that these are very challenging times for media and news organisations around the world, and as a result, we, along with other outlets, are having to change our business model. Pretty soon you'll see that we are offering the first few articles you read each month on scmp.com for free, after which you'll be asked to subscribe. Now, this won't change your access to podcasts on whatever platform you're listening, but subscribing will make a huge difference to making sure that we on the Political Economy Desk, as well as our colleagues around the SCMP, keep our high quality journalism coming to you 24/7. Great to be joined on the line today from Washington, D.C. by our US Bureau Chief, Robert Delaney. Rob and his team in Washington have been covering this latest fallout in the US-China trade war, TikTok, Chinese-owned app, short video app, which has been exploding in terms of its popularity around the world, but which they are now looking to ban in the United States or to find an American buyer for the app. Rob, thanks for joining us. What, from your perspective, is the latest in this story? Where do we stand with TikTok, and what's been the chatter about how this has been dragged into this growing tech war?
Well, the latest development on this is just happened just a few minutes ago. Really, the U.S. Senate approved a bill on today that will ban TikTok from any use by government employees, whether they are not only government employees, but government officers, government lawmakers, and even contractors. Anyone falling in this category is no longer allowed to download TikTok. And so this is just the latest in a series of moves that threaten the existence of TikTok in the U.S. And we've seen interest from Microsoft in buying it. And there have been suggestions that perhaps other companies, they would have to be U.S. companies, are also possibly in talks with the parent ByteDance to buy it. But it's all part of the larger story of the concern in Washington among lawmakers, in addition to the Trump administration, about the possibility that the Chinese government is spying on Americans or collecting data on Americans through technology such as TikTok.
This is one of a number of Chinese apps which have been mentioned in the same conversation, WeChat being another. Obviously, the main form of communication for many Chinese people these days. And as a journalist, I suppose when you're speaking with sources and contacts in China, you probably use WeChat quite a lot as well, Rob.
I do, yes. And of course, every time I use it now, I keep in mind that I might not be able to use it in the future, in the not too distant future. So it's I kind of keep tabs on this, on who I'm keeping in touch with through WeChat. And I feel like the next move is going to be, hey, any other apps that you use?
Or a spike in VPN sales among the journalistic community in Washington.
Right, exactly. So this is kind of top of mind at the moment.
The hawks in the administration have been very vocal about this. Peter Navarro is one, and I know for a fact I've been reading a few accounts this week about how he has actually been dismissive even of Microsoft's bid to buy TikTok, his argument being that Microsoft is in bed with the Chinese government. Of course, Microsoft has a storied history in China. Internet Explorer and the Office suite are very commonly used among Chinese government, although I read a quote yesterday from one of the executives which said they are very rarely paid for, which is another story. But is there a sense that this Microsoft potential purchase would face enough pushback to maybe put it off the rails?
Well, I think it's important to keep in mind that Peter Navarro is such a vocal critic of China. And it seems that in Peter Navarro's view, anyone who's done any business ever in China since 1949 is somehow guilty of propping up the Chinese Communist Party. So, and I think it's quite an extreme view that he has, and I think it's worth pointing out that when he made the comment back earlier this week about how Microsoft has always been in bed with the Chinese government, there was a very brief moment where that attracted news. A few headlines flew, but then very quickly after that, Donald Trump gave essentially he gave his approval. He was very publicly said that he has okayed the talks between Microsoft and ByteDance. So I think that's an indication of how, yes, there are very hawkish voices within the administration and of course also within Congress about who might be entitled to buy TikTok. It ultimately reverts back to a general understanding that business is business, and if whoever wants to buy it can put to rest any concerns that the buyer would, or the TikTok would still somehow be able to transfer data to Beijing or to the Chinese government, as long as they can put those concerns to rest, and of course that it's an American company, a sale should be able to come through.
Secretary of State Mike Pompeo this week had come out with a plan known as the Clean Network. This was a way of perhaps doing what you've said, make sure that none of these, no apps are feeding information or anything back to their governments. I think it's specifically aimed at China. And the China hands on social media have latched onto this week. I'm sure you've seen, Rob, and they've been describing this as a firewall with another name. This to me seems quite an interesting development, that the US is at least being accused of taking a leaf out of the CCP's book in trying to control the internet. Is that what we're seeing here?
I think I think the the overall objective is not so much being able to control the internet as it is about closing or blocking off any channel that a Chinese owned online company would be able to use or to exploit that would endanger U.S. national security. That is the private data of either the U.S. government or private citizens in the U.S. So I don't think this initiative, or I don't think this mindset starts from a desire to control the internet. I think it really starts from this suspicion that the Chinese government is doing everything that it possibly can on many different levels to kind of vacuum up data from the U.S. And of course, there are so many channels that you can think of, simply because the internet and online platforms have become so numerous. And of course, you've got the leader in the world in terms of these online platforms. The leaders are the US and China. So if you're trying to block all of these channels that might go back to China, then it certainly looks like the US is trying to control the internet. But I think they're really trying to address. They're trying to plug every possible hole that would lead data back to the Chinese government.
Yeah, maybe they should consult former President Bill Clinton on trying to nail Jell-O to the wall with that one.
Exactly.
Is there? This is the issue of the week, Rob. And every time we speak, there's something else quite explosive. But I mean, how are you guys keeping track of everything that's going on? We wake up in Hong Kong every morning to a plethora of new things going on in the US-China dynamic. But what are the challenges covering it journalistically?
It's a matter of just kind of. How should I say? Kind of just being in the ready stance is the only way I can describe it. It's just a matter of logging on and checking who's doing a briefing today. Is the White House doing a briefing? Is the State Department doing a briefing? Is the Defense Department doing a briefing? And understand and getting everyone in place so that we can cover as many of these briefings as possible, and with the understanding that at any of these briefings, we may get some announcement that could signal a significant change in U.S. policy towards China, or some kind of the latest bold action by the U.S. government directed at China. It's just sort of being both mentally prepared and having the editors and reporters in place, kind of ready to go. And we're getting used to this now.
Yeah, you've been on this footing for some time now, so it's probably become habitual at this point. Not going to ease up between now and November, Rob. Do you get a sense that even though normal business hasn't resumed in terms of everyday life, people are still getting into the election mood?
I think people are. It's hard to tell. Well, number one, because in the world we live in, it kind of limits the amount of people you can talk to about the issues. But yeah, the election, I think it's interesting. I think there's so much concern about how much fallout will affect people economically. That it feels in the U.S. that there are so many questions swirling around about, well, as the U.S. government intervention in terms of the Paycheck Protection Plan and the support for small businesses who have been hurt by the pandemic, this money is running out, and it seems like there's more of a concern about what's going to happen in the next few weeks. And those concerns are kind of overshadowing what's going to happen in the election, because I think people have generally made up their minds about Trump and Biden, and I don't think there's a lot of people aren't kind of waiting for the next signal to somehow help them make their decision in the election.
Oh, I guess what you see is what you get on both counts there. It's nothing really to learn about either candidate, but I'm sure that we will touch base with you down the line, Rob, as we get closer to the election. For now, thanks so much for joining us, and the best of luck with all the coverage.
My pleasure. Thanks very much.
Thanks for listening to the US-China Trade War podcast with me, Finbar Birmingham. You can keep up with all the week's news on the trade war, on the coronavirus, and on everything in between at scmp.com. We're at SCMP Economy on Twitter. I'm at FBirmingham. That's Birmingham with a B-E-R, not like the city. We'll see you back here next week, and until then, keep your distance, keep washing those hands, and keep wearing those masks.
For more podcasts from the South China Morning Post, head to scmp.com, where you can hear more about technology, trade, culture, and society.